G'day and welcome back to the channel. So in today's video, I want to show you how to permanently loosen a tight piriformis muscle. Clinically, a tight piriformis is commonly linked to a whole range of different lower back and hip dysfunctions. If you have piriformis syndrome or sciatica, you'll know all too well the important role that a tight piriformis might be playing in your symptoms. But as I'm doing with a number of these videos, I want to show you how to not only improve how that tight piriformis feels, but we need to take a step back to understand why it's become tight in the first place, treat that at the same time, if we're ever going to have a conversation about what you need to do to permanently fix it and get it to go away. There are two main reasons why a piriformis muscle is asked to be tight in the first place. And in this instance, that something else is often lower back dysfunction or hip dysfunction. So it goes without saying that if we don't give you something to improve the function of your back and something to improve the function of your hip, then we may never be getting to the underlying cause of why that piriformis has become tight, and all the piriformis stretches that we'll get to and that you may have done in the past may ultimately be for nothing. So let's get into it. So as I've been doing with these videos, we want to make sure that you have a very clear understanding of how tight your piriformis muscle feels to begin with, so that as we do each of these exercises and cover these ideas, you can immediately come back to that same test to instantly get a sense of whether it's actually done something. Because as always, I don't want you to feel like you have to trust me. We need to base everything that we do on results, because that way you will know specifically how each of these exercises affects your tight piriformis and which ones are the most meaningful and important for you to do. For me, clinically as a physiotherapist, one of the easiest ways to test for how tight your piriformis may be is to simply sit down and cross your leg. Now, obviously I'm doing this on the floor, but you're welcome to do this sitting down on a chair, on a bed, on a couch, doesn't matter where you do it. You just want to try and get your leg up into this position, and that may be enough on its own to expose how tight that gluteal piriformis area is for you. The idea is we want to get a general sense of how this feels, and then if you can get into this position to start with, we then want you from your hip, keeping your back nice and tall, to hinge forward as far as you feel comfortable, again taking up all the slack in that hip, and then on top of that you can just gently twist your trunk towards your foot or twist your trunk towards your knee to find which version of this gives you the best access to that piriformis muscle tightness. We want to come back to this immediately after doing each one of these exercises to see what's changed. That way, again, you don't have to trust me. You can just base this on which one of these exercises you feel gives you the best results. And then let's see what impact that hidden dysfunction in your lower back may be having on your tight piriformis. So once you've taken note of how tight your piriformis may or may not be at the start of this video, we then want to go hunting for and free up any spinal joint dysfunction at the base of your rib cage and the top of your lower back. This section, that base of your rib cage, top of your lower back, is a common area of dysfunction that asks a whole bunch of muscles further down the chain to tighten in compensation. So if you do have tight hamstrings, a tight QL, tight hip flexors, and anything in that area, this same segment of the back could be the reason why all of those muscles are tight, especially if it's one side that feels tighter than the other. But a great way to figure this out is if you can take a lacrosse ball, a tennis ball, you can use a foam roller, obviously, you can use whatever device you feel is the most comfortable and the most respectful to how you feel doing this. But for me, I'm going to use the lacrosse ball, and I'm going to start by placing the ball around about into the base of my rib cage, right in the middle, and then I'm just going to let that roll off to the side of fraction. And the idea here is that when we lie down on the ball, or you can do this standing up against a wall or sitting up against a wall if it's more convenient to you. But what we're looking for here is we're looking for the joint dysfunction in your back. When you're at the base of your rib cage, there may also be a rib joint that attaches very close to that. But ultimately what we're looking for when comparing the left to the right hand side is we're looking for joints in your back that feel stiffer, tighter, harder, thicker, or more dense than they do when you compare it to the same spot on the other side. And what you should feel is that one side, and for me this side feels a little bit softer when compared to this side closest to the camera. And what I would like you to do is, once you've found a spot that feels a bit harder and stiffer than the opposite side, and again, as I always say, it doesn't necessarily matter whether it's tender or not. You don't have to be walking around with back pain to have back dysfunction. But if the joints and tissue in your back is stiff, tight, and restricted at a level that has the nerves and the neural connections that influence your piriformis muscle function, then your piriformis muscle can become tight through compensation or to help out. So once you've found a spot that you would consider feels a bit stiff, tight, and restricted, just gently let the ball or the foam roller gently press into that area for 1 to 2 minutes. If it does feel tender, Just make sure you focus on your breathing to calm everything down. Once you've done that, then just move the ball up a fraction or down a fraction. Go hunting in that area for anything and everything that feels stiff, tight, and restricted. And if you have successfully started to mobilize to free up some of that tissue, then what you should instantly feel is that when you get back into the same position that you were in before, you should then feel like you can go that little bit further than you could before. And for me, it feels instantly that little bit looser than it did before. So hopefully the visual that I just put up does highlight that for you. But again, don't take my word for this. Do this yourself and see what it does to you. And then let us know in the comments down below. Because again, if you are going to the trouble of stretching out a tight piriformis, then you will consistently have to keep doing that unless we get to the underlying reason for why that is there in the first place. And one of the main reasons that I find clinically is that subtle stiffness in your lower back, that when you free that up, you might find that that piriformis feels a little bit stronger and a little bit looser straight away. But then the other thing that we need to test out is we also need to assess how tight and restricted your hip joint is to see if that is one of the structures deeper to that piriformis that's asking for help and support at the same time. So once you've got a sense of how much your lower back joint dysfunction may be influencing your tight piriformis, we then want to make sure that we explore how tight your hip joint capsule might be to see if that's also influencing that tight piriformis. And again, a great way to do this clinically is if we can get you on all fours, and with the side that we're going to stretch, we want to take the opposite leg back. And there's 3 parts to this mobility drill. We want to imagine that ultimately your thigh bone is gently pressing out the back corner of your hip. It's not a traditional muscle stretch where you might feel the tissue in that area stretching. It's just a pressure feeling. Because what we're trying to do here is if we get you just to gently come down into a bit more hip flexion and then keeping your shoulders and your hips together, we want to shift your trunk and your shoulders as a whole towards the side that you're trying to mobilize. We don't want you to disconnect your hips and drop your hips down. We want to move everything horizontally across the ground, looking for a gentle pressure at the back side of that hip. And then once you've found this, we genuinely just want you to stay here for 30 seconds or 60 seconds. Again, imagining that that thigh bone is pressing out the back side of that hip, encouraging that tight joint capsule to give. And once you spend a minute or 2 in this position, we want to try and bias different parts of that joint capsule to see if it does assist that piriformis to loosen up a bit faster. So the other version of this is keeping that back leg back. We want to rotate the leg that we're stretching underneath and then block that with your other leg. Same thing applies. We're still trying to shift everything together across to that side, but then this time, instead of feeling it at the side, you might feel it a little bit more towards the back where that piriformis might be. Again, we can hang out here for 30 seconds, a minute, 2 minutes, gently encouraging that tissue to relax and give. And once you've had enough of that one, we can come back to the middle again, disconnect your leg, straighten your other one back out again. And then instead of going inwards, we want to rotate your foot outwards. Now, this one can jam up a tight hip. So if you rotate your leg outwards and you feel it jamming up the front, then just come out of that hip flex position a little bit more before coming back and across. So with this particular one, keeping your foot where it is and shifting everything across, you're not going to feel it at the side. You shouldn't hopefully feel it at the back. You might feel it a little bit more towards the front, but again, it won't be a jamming sort of pinching feeling. It'll be a gentle pressure. So we're essentially just trying to mobilize that hip joint capsule through a lot of the range that it has to see what, if anything, is stopping that piriformis from permanently being loose. And then as before, getting back into sort of the same shape as before. So for me, it automatically feels easier to get into this position, but keeping myself up nice and tall, hinging forward until I feel some tightness. Again, I feel like I'm going down a lot further. And then when I twist towards the side and then twist towards the other side, again, I feel like I'm going a lot further before I reach that point. So for me, some lower back stiffness is part of the puzzle. Some hip joint capsular restriction is also part of that tight piriformis puzzle. So again, let me know in the comments down below which one of those 2 may have given you the most instant freedom through that tight piriformis. So once you've mobilized some of the potential hidden underlying causes of that piriformis muscle tightness, we obviously want to give you a piriformis stretch that works. And what I've seen clinically over the years is the default technique that we use is very similar to the test that we did to start with, where if you're sitting down, you cross your leg, you bend forwards. But what we've often asked you to do is once you've found that tightness, we've just asked you to hang out here for 30 seconds seconds or so and hope that that muscle gives. And while this might be beneficial to some degree, it's nowhere near as optimal or as effective as tensing that muscle tightness in that stretch position. So essentially what we want you to do is, again, choose a position that gives you access to that tightness. So for me, sitting cross-legged, sitting up nice and tall, again, hinging forwards, twisting towards my foot, twisting towards my knee. I feel like going this way really lights up that sort of piriformis area more than anything. So instead of hanging out here and hoping that it changes, I need to tense up my glutes, squeeze my butt cheek. I might need to push my foot back down into my other leg. I need to make that work for 5 to 10 seconds. Again, as you may know, it creates a reflex in your brain that when you stop tensing while maintaining this position, it'll instantly ask that tight piriformis to give a little bit. And what you should notice straight away is that if you have maintained the position and not taken the tension off, you should then feel like you can immediately go that little bit further into the stretch than what you could before. And then all you need to do is, once you've found that new position, you've taken up that new slack, again, tense that same muscular tightness again, 5-10 seconds. When you give, it'll give. You'll be able to drop down deeper and deeper again. And again, you can do it in different directions just to see if that gives you different access to that tight piriformis. But if you are not specifically tensing the tight musculature that you're wanting to release, you may not be making immediate change. And it's one of the reasons why a lot of people aren't fans of stretching, because they don't feel like it works, because it probably isn't. But as soon as you activate that tight musculature, you deserve to see an immediate difference to some degree. And then again, as we said, once you have stretched it, you then come back. Obviously, when we retest your movement, you should automatically feel like there's more range of motion to play with than what there was before. And then another piece of the puzzle that we can focus on is that we want to then try and replace some of that muscular tightness with muscular strength. So when trying to strengthen your piriformis muscle, the anatomy of the piriformis dictates that when your leg or your hip is straight and it's below a 90-degree angle, your piriformis muscle is very good at externally rotating a straight leg. And a really interesting way to do this is with an exercise called an aeroplane. And all it essentially asks us to do is, standing on one leg, preferably with something to hold on to so you can maintain your balance, you can have one foot behind you, and we want you to bend forward as far as you feel comfortable. You can have a little bit of a bend in your knee if you feel a bit of tension through the nerve at the back of your leg. And all we're trying to do is, because your piriformis muscle externally rotates your foot, when your foot's on the ground, we want to basically open yourself up away from the side that you're working on. And what you should feel is the muscles in your hip, that hip external rotation, the piriformis muscle, should shorten to twist your trunk to the opposite side. Again, we don't want you to rotate your trunk. We want to keep your shoulders and your hips together, and we want to rotate everything together at the same time. And what you'll find is, after 10 or 15 of these, you'll start to notice a decent amount of fatigue in that piriformis area. Now, when you do rotate around, you may need to lift your foot, your back foot, further up off the ground to make that happen. If you want to make it a little bit harder, you can certainly lift one leg up off the ground, extending forwards as far as you feel comfortable, and then again, rotating, keeping everything the same, and obviously dropping down deeper and deeper, the more strength and control you develop. But very quickly, you'll start to feel a whole bunch of piriformis and deep gluteal muscle fatigue, which is exactly what we're looking for. And again, try and replace some of that piriformis muscular tightness with muscular strength and stability. And then once you've done that, we just need to talk about one more thing, which will hopefully help explain why we're even having this conversation to begin with. So once you've gone through the process of exploring what role your back and your hip has on your tight piriformis, you've found a version of a piriformis stretch that works for you, and you've been able to generate some fatigue through that piriformis muscle, we now need to have a talk about why we're even having these conversations in the first place. Clinically, as a physiotherapist, everything musculoskeletally has to happen for a reason. So as we've talked about, if you found that your piriformis is tight, and when you free up your hip or your lower back, it immediately feels less tight, then you can automatically assume that the tightnesses have asked that piriformis to be tight. But in order to completely understand this in its entirety, we also need to understand that why has your hip or your back become stiff and tight in those areas in the first place? And again, as always, I say this all the time, but if you've been a fan of the channel, if you've followed these permanently loosened videos that I'm putting out, you'll ultimately know that one of the main reasons why hips get tight, lower backs get stiff, it's often a reflection of the shapes, the positions, and the postures that you put your tissue in the most throughout the day. And overwhelmingly, that often relates to something as boring and as uninteresting as sitting. So if you are someone who sits at a desk all day, who sits in a car a lot, if you like to sit on the couch when you're relaxing, if you play an instrument, if you read books, use your phone, if you sit up in bed, do whatever you need to do. If there's shapes and postures that you get into quite frequently that do ask you to either have your hips bent at 90 degrees the whole time and not necessarily exploring the full depths of your hip range of motion, your hip joint capsule can become stiffer. If you're someone who, when sitting or standing and bending over, you are slumping or slouching or hinging through that very section of your back that you found was stiff and tight with the ball or the roller, then you may unknowingly be asking those tissues to be stiff and stay stiff and dysfunctional indefinitely. So as with everything, if you have come to the conclusion that your tight piriformis is something that you need to get rid of just because you want to or because it's playing an important role in your pain and dysfunction, then it's unrealistic to expect that a tight piriformis will ever eventually become loose if we don't then talk about the boring sort of shapes, postures and situations that you put that tissue into the most. And often it's just as simple as trying to stand up more, or if you can't stand up more and get out of that cemented on 90-degree hip range, then you might need to do something like the hip joint capsule stretch more often just to buffer that better. But if you can stand up more, or when you are sitting, try and make sure that you're not kicking a hinge into your spine, that you're trying to be up as straight and as tall as you can, then we're going to stop isolating specific segments of your spine, especially if it's one side more than the other, which may again suggest that there's some asymmetry involved in that shape. But the more you can pair this sort of stuff up with the exercises and the stretches that we've just been through, then the more likely you are to permanently loosen that tight piriformis and any other subtle random dysfunctions that you might be dealing with that you didn't realize was connected. So as always, I genuinely hope that was helpful. Let me know in the comments down below what effect that had on you, if any at all. Support the channel by please leaving a like rating on the video. Subscribe if you want to see more of this type of content and this resonates with you. Please consider leaving a super thanks if you did find this genuinely helpful. But ultimately, I sincerely do hope that that had an impact and it did help give you a broader perspective on why your piriformis might be tight in the first place, and obviously what you can do to try and iron that out long term. But as always, thank you for watching and I hope to see you next time.